Okay, I think we'll go ahead and begin now. I'd like to welcome everybody to this evening's talk as part of the Asia Center's Philippine Lecture Series. My name is James Robson. I'm the Victor and William Fung Director of the Harvard Asia Center. And tonight this talk is recorded, and there will be time for Q&A at the end of the talk. And we ask you to use the Q&A function on Zoom to ask your questions, and I'll curate those for our speaker tonight. This talk is part of the Asia Center's series, as I mentioned, but it is also co-sponsored this evening by the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies here at Harvard as well. So we're very thankful for them for that co-sponsorship. So our speaker this evening is well known to many people at the Fairbanks Center here at Harvard, somebody who's actively engaged and on the board of the Fairbanks Center as well. Professor Robert Ross is a professor of political science at Boston College and also an associate of the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies here. He received his PhD in political science from Columbia University in 1984. He's also taught at Columbia University and at the University of Washington. 1989, he was also a guest scholar at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. From 1994 to 95, he was a Fulbright professor at the Chinese Foreign Affairs College. And in 2003, he was a visiting senior fellow at the Institute of International and Strategic Studies at Tsinghua University. In 2014, he was a visiting scholar at the School of International Relations in Beijing. And in 2009, he was also a visiting scholar at the Institute for Strategy at the Royal Danish Defense College. And from 2009 to 2014, he's been an adjunct professor at the Institute for Defense Studies at the Norwegian Defense University College. So Professor Ross is published widely, and is primary specialty is in the area of Chinese security policy and defense policy, East Asian security more generally, and U.S. China relations. His most recent publications include Chinese security policy, structure, power, and politics, also China's ascent, power, security, and the future of international politics, and also new directions in the study of Chinese foreign policy. He's also published on a number of other wide-ranging topics that include looking at China's Vietnam policy, for example, and publishes many articles in leading journals from World Politics to the China Quarterly to Asian Survey, Foreign Affairs, and so on. Many of his books and articles have been translated into Chinese and published in China, Taiwan, South Korea, and Japan, and other European countries. He's also very actively involved in outreach to government and has testified before the various Senate and House committees and the Defense Policy Advisory Board. He advises U.S. government agencies and also serves as on the academic advisory group of the U.S. China Working Group for the United States Congress. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the National Committee for U.S. China Relations, and he is also a member of the Executive Committee at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies here. So I'd like to welcome everybody again to this talk this evening, and Professor Ross's title of his talk is Wedge Strategies and Alliance Politics, Chinese Coercion and the U.S. Philippine Alliance. So let me turn the microphone over to you, Professor Ross, and very much look forward to your talk this evening.
Thank you very much, James. This is a great opportunity. Usually I speak to a China audience, and I look down the list of participants, and it's a wide range of participants. We have Filipinos, we have China specialists. So I hope this gives us a good conversation about China-Philippine relations and what drives this relationship from the Chinese perspective, I might say. If you were to classify me and help you know where I'm coming from, I would strongly fit into what we might call the realist school and American understanding of international relations. And so I apply my realist lens, if you will, to China and the Philippines, and particularly in how China developed policy toward the Philippines. In that context, I've looked at how China is a rising power, how it behaves, and what its aspirations are. My underlying assumption is that China is indeed a revisionist power. It does not like the status quo in East Asia. For after all, since the end of World War II till today, the United States has been the maritime hegemon in East Asia, with air and naval bases surrounding China's coastal perimeter. bases in South Korea, bases in Japan, bases in the Philippines, Singapore de facto base at Changi, cooperation with de facto security cooperation with Malaysia and anti-submarine activities. The United States, in that very much geopolitical world, has encircled China's coastline with bases all around its perimeter. And so my understanding is as China has developed greater capabilities, air capabilities, naval capabilities, its foremost objective, more than any other objective you can go down the agenda of Chinese foreign policy, as to revise strategic order in East Asia to get the Americans off their perimeter. Or to put it differently, to weaken American security partnerships in East Asia, that America cannot use the local powers in East Asia to encircle China and undermine Chinese security. Now, we all recall the American pivot to East Asia, which I'll come back to in a bit, but the American pivot in East Asia was a response to the rise of China, concerned that China's rise would undermine American security cooperation with the countries in East Asia. And what the United States did is it reached out to other countries. It reached out to the Philippines, it reached out to South Korea, it also reached out to Vietnam, and all these countries the United States reached out to and said, let's expand or strengthen our security cooperation. And the reason was quite obvious: to try and resist the rise of China, undermine them, and to resist the decline of American presence in East Asia. Now, the problem for China is when a country like South Korea, the Philippines, or Vietnam cooperate with the United States on whatever interest drove them, it simultaneously contributed to American power in China's periphery. And that, if you will, explains much of China's concern for East Asia going back to 2010, 2012. And so I want to look at China-Philippine relations in that context and understand that China's objective here is to weaken the American presence in the Philippines, because American presence in the Philippines contributes to American military power in the perimeter of China, which makes China's coastal regions vulnerable and China's coastal waters vulnerable to American power. No great power, no rising power would simply accept that. And so in many respects, when I look at China's behavior today, I look at China's objectives, and even how it's wielded its growing power, I'm not surprised. This is, to me, it's not aggression. It's not belligerence. This is what I would think would be expected behavior of a rising power to reorder a region for greater security. After all, this is what the United States did at the turn of the 20th century. Many countries have done this, and China is just the latest example. So we shouldn't see China as, if you will, sui generis, or particularly aggressive, particularly belligerent, but behaving as one might expect it to behave. Now, to understand Chinese policy toward the Philippines, I want to walk this through three stages in Chinese policy. And these three stages correspond to Philippine governments and how they have developed policy toward China. And I'll briefly talk about first the Arroyo administration and Chinese policy toward the Arroyo administration, then move to the Aquino administration, then move to the Duterte administration, then try and see what's coming up now with the Marcos government and what we might expect and what troubles may lie ahead. So in the Arroyo administration, we need to remember that when the Arroyo government came into power in 1996, I believe. Is that right? I'll repeat correctly. The number one issue on the agenda was China's occupation and construction on Mistress Reef. Relations were bad. Mistress Reef had become quite the controversial issue, and bilateral relations were embroiled in this territorial dispute, this sovereignty dispute in the South China Sea. Now, Arroyo came in and made very clear that this was not going to be a problem for her government in relations with China. She said she would simply not challenge Chinese activities in the South China Sea, and that she would not take sides in U.S. China relations. She would not let the sovereignty dispute spoil relations with China. And this is even though Chinese ships were operating all around these waters that Philippines claim for themselves, fishing in those waters, Coast Guard operating in those waters. Arroyo made clear this is simply not going to be an issue. I will overlook Chinese activities in Philippine claimed waters in the interest of cooperating with China. In 2004, Arroyo reached an agreement for China, even for joint exploration of waters in the South China Sea. It's a significant agreement. because from the Chinese perspective, recall that China has never demanded that any country in Southeast Asia or East Asia recognize Chinese claims. Rather, what China has said is, don't challenge Chinese claims. And so for China, this agreement for joint exploration wasn't actually an agreement to do anything. But it was said that if anything gets done, it will not be done unilaterally by another country, but rather it will be done with China or not at all, and not at all is just fine because no one challenges China. And so this was an agreement that China welcomed. Royal said that China is a major power, determines the security of my country, and we need to get along. And in that respect, she made clear that cooperation with the Americans would not challenge Chinese security. So the annual Balakan exercises with the U.S. military were kept far away from the disputed waters in the South China Sea. The American Navy did not cooperate with the Philippine Navy in waters that China felt were sensitive, making clear to the Chinese U.S. Philippine relations will not challenge Chinese interests. Now, Chinese satisfaction with the relationship was clear, one, because Philippine fishing was quite productive and unobstructed throughout the waters in the South China Sea. So that Philippine fishermen prospered with no interruption. Second of all, economic cooperation between China and the Philippines took off. And after 2001, bilateral trade between China and the Philippines increased on the average of over 40% a year. Quite significant. Between 2000 and 2008, China moved to become the third largest export market for the Philippines, up from number 11. And China also began to compete with Japan as the number one provider to the Philippines of soft loans. So China's recognition of Philippine impartiality in the United States and China, its willingness to put aside the territorial dispute, not recognize Chinese claims, but not challenge Chinese claims, also appealed to China. And China was able to allow all the fishing and all the economic cooperation that the Philippines might want. China, in retrospect, called this the honeymoon of China-Philippine relations. Now, all this changed when President Aquino took power. And very quickly, Aquino said, this is going to be different. My administration will not allow Chinese challenges to Philippine sovereignty in the South China Sea. I will not shelve the territorial dispute in the interest of good relations with China. So in March of 2011, the Philippines opened up the waters in Reed Bank to international exploration of energy resources to a foreign company. Chinese made it clear this was not something they were going to welcome, and their ships quickly approached the foreign company's resource exploration vehicles, platforms, and chased them away. Nonetheless, the Aquino administration took the territorial dispute and began procedures in the United Nations to challenge Chinese claims. And Aquino said that they were prepared to use international law to challenge Chinese claims to Philippine territory. Now, in of itself, that might have been something the Chinese were going to be very unhappy with, but nonetheless, perhaps prepared to tolerate. But coinciding with the Aquino administration's challenge with Chinese sovereignty claims, however outrageous they may or may not be, the Philippines and the United States began intensive improvement in military cooperation. So here was the Philippines reaching out to the United States, give us greater security support, give us greater military support. The United States says, we'll be more than happy to, and the Philippines is simultaneously challenging Chinese sovereignty claims. The conjunction of those two trends is what China found unacceptable. Now, the trend was very clear in 2011-12. In November of 2011, Foreign Secretary of State Clinton visited the Philippines. And she went to Manila Bay, a place of great significance in U.S. Philippine military cooperation. She boarded a U.S. naval ship in Manila Bay, and she said, basically to the Philippines, we have your back. You can count on us to defend you. And of course, this was taking place just as the Philippines was encountering greater difficulties with China and challenging Chinese sovereignty claims. Indeed, just days before Clinton arrived in Manila Bay, an American, Aquino, said that he would open up Reed Bank to an American drilling company to explore for oil. It's in that context that Secretary Clinton appears in Manila Bay. It certainly looks to the Chinese and to others that Aquino is manipulating the Americans to support a more forward-leaning territorial policy. Now, throughout 2011, China had some private conversation with the Philippines about these trends. The foreign ministry would have a quiet protest. The Chinese embassy in Manila would hold some meetings. But China, and those of you who study China know this, the media is an important signaling device in Chinese diplomacy. The Chinese media was silent on the Philippines. Chinese scholars were silent on the Philippines. Research in Chinese think tank journals, nothing on the Philippines. People's Daily, Xinhua News Agency, nothing on the Philippines. So we might characterize this period as a wait-and-see policy. China's watching the movement of Philippine sovereignty policy and its movement in U.S. Philippine relations, waiting to see how far the Aquino administration will go in challenging China's interest, not necessarily in sovereignty, but in bringing the United States into the South China Sea, strengthening defense cooperation. In early January 2012, the Philippines reached agreement with the United States to expand military cooperation and host greater U.S. Army and naval forces on Philippine territory, and this changed Chinese politics. For Chinese observers, this would be think tanks throughout the country, both in Beijing and Shanghai and elsewhere, in their various foreign policy magazines and in academic journals. Philippine movement to improve military cooperation with the United States was fundamental to changing Chinese policy. And the reason was clear. The United States had intervened in the sovereignty dispute between China and the Philippines. It had encouraged the Philippines to challenge China. Why? So that it would have greater opportunity to intervene itself into Southeast Asian affairs and to increase American presence in the region, and thus resist the rise of China. The United States was using maritime disputes, particularly involving the Philippines, to balance against China and to distract and contain China in the South China Sea. As one scholar put it, the purpose of U.S. intervention in the sovereignty disputes was to incite greater conflict between China and its neighbors, thus giving the United States an opportunity, a greater opportunity to increase its presence in the context of the rise of China. But we begin to see Chinese policy changing. We see academic journals, but that wasn't the fundamental turning point. Fundamental turning point was Scarborough Shoal. Now, what I'm saying here, and have been saying, is that if we look at China's gray zone activities, we look at China's resistance to the Philippine sovereignty activities, the issue is not the sovereignty dispute. Why do I say that? I say that for two reasons. Three reasons. One, there is no significant energy deposit anywhere in the South China Sea that make it a valuable resource region. The United States Energy Agency has made clear that the South China Sea, in terms of potential reserves, ranks about 180th in the world, almost nothing. Reed Bank may have some, but not a lot to make a difference. So what's driving China is not resources. Second, the islands are worthless for military affairs because they're too small, and even the man-made islands cannot survive a conflict. And China's policy is clear. Let's just shelve the sovereignty dispute. They've said this to the Philippines. They're willing to do joint exploration, and they have never demanded other countries recognize Chinese territorial claims. The issue all along has been American presence, and shelving this issue so it doesn't get in the way of China's ability to compete with the United States for the alignment and friendship of the local powers. Well, Scarborough Shoal was no different. Scarborough Shoal was not about who owns Scarborough Shoal. It was not about who can fish in Scarborough Shoal, but rather it was a culmination of Chinese observations of U.S. Philippine cooperation culminating in that event. And what happened in that event? Well, you had Chinese fishermen fishing inside Scarborough Shoal, and the Philippines sent in a Navy ship. Well, that was the first thing that undoubtedly got Chinese attention, because this was the first time a Philippine military vessel had gone to detain Chinese fishermen, something of an escalation. Second of all, it was the Philippine ship that had once been the USS Hamilton. Oh, this was a U.S. military ship given to the Philippines. Significance would not have been lost. So that for the Chinese, and third, this is in the context of what had gone on before, and for the Chinese, this was an opportunity. I think they were quite grateful for what happened in Scarborough Shoal. Because if the Chinese fishermen got on their cell phones, they said, we're about to be detained by the Philippine naval ship. And the Chinese sent their Coast Guard to Scarborough Shoal, and they sealed the shoal. No one gets in, no one gets out. Well, for the Philippine naval ship, that's very dangerous. You have a limited amount of food on the ship, limited amount of water, and you can't get out without crossing the Chinese Navy Coast Guard, and the Navy's not far behind the Coast Guard. So what the Chinese did, I would argue, is they created a crisis. Now, this was not a crisis for China, but it was a crisis for the Philippines. What would happen if they tried to run the Chinese blockade of Scarborough Shoal and ships got sunk? That might be very dangerous. Or what happens if they stayed in the shoal and their sailors begin to have hunger issues and famine issues? That could be very dangerous. So the Chinese were basically daring the Philippines. You want to escalate? Go for it. And the Chinese actually said that. The deputy foreign minister said Chinese are prepared for any escalation of the conflict that the Philippines might cause, which is another way of saying the Chinese were prepared for war. Now, again, from the Chinese perspective, it was not an accident that 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the detainment or the Philippine naval entry into the lagoon of Scarborough Shoal, the United States and the Philippines began their annual military exercises, including naval exercises. Again, the Philippines were relying on the American presence, greater cooperation with the United States to challenge China. The Americans came to the rescue of the Philippines. Americans negotiated mutual withdrawal from the Philippines. Both sides would withdraw their ships and allow the fishermen to leave. And that happened. The Philippine Coast Guard ship, the erstwhile Hamilton, left the shoal, and the Chinese fishing boats left the shoal, and the Chinese Coast Guard, blocking the shoal, stood out of the way. But once all the ships had left, Philippine and Chinese fishing boats, trying to close the lagoon to Scarborough Shoal, it stretched a cable across the lagoon. No one was going to fish in that lagoon anymore. And simultaneously, the Chinese carried out extensive harassment activities around Scarborough Shoal. So basically, your Philippine fishermen lost their traditional fishing grounds all around Scarborough Shoal, which was detrimental to the Philippine fishing economy. Now, in other cases where the Chinese had used such tactics, and I would say the Vietnam was one earlier in 2014. No, actually, the Philippines was the first, but perhaps in hope that the Philippines would reconsider their policy. But the Aquino administration did not, and actually they did the opposite. The Aquino administration doubled down on cooperation with the United States to challenge Chinese sovereignty. And the touchstone with this was the 2014 Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement between the Philippines and the United States, which allowed the United States to station troops all around the Philippines and expand American military presence in the Philippines. In 2013 and in 2014 as well, the United States held multiple exercises, naval exercise with the Philippines, expanding the size and frequency of those exercises to go with the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. China was clear. The purpose of this Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement was to target China. So they would say the Philippines have their interests, the Americans have their interests. They both want to use the other to realize their mutual interest. The Philippines was thereby helping the United States realize its interest to contain the rise of China. And so for the Chinese, the EDCA was a key part of the American pivot to Asia, to militarize the South China Sea, to expand the American military presence, and to get the backing of the Philippines for the pivot to contain China. And the day was over when the Chinese were going to rely on cooperation with the Philippines. Appeasement was over. Only coercion was going to work. If you wanted to stop U.S. Philippine cooperation, drive that wedge, you had to be coercive. Moreover, the United States policy during Scarborough Shoal was quite reassuring to the Chinese. We didn't take sides. Both sides have to lead. The American objective was to prevent a crisis from escalating and might lead to hostilities that might require the Americans to intervene on behalf of the Philippines and go to war against China over Scarborough Shoal. Not going to happen. So what did the Americans do? They took a distant position. Both sides need to withdraw. Let's avoid conflict escalation. So for the Chinese, what did this mean? The Americans do not want to get involved with the Philippines over the sovereignty dispute, which gave the Chinese a free hand to use the sovereignty dispute as a pretext to expand its coercion against the Philippines to get it to reconsider its U.S. policy. So in the aftermath of Scarborough Shoal, China upped its coercion of the Philippines. Its Coast Guard continued to have significant harassment of Philippine fishing boats and expanded its naval presence in disputed waters. It's at this time that the Chinese began their land reclamation activities in the reefs around the Philippines. So, we all remember when the Chinese were building their reefs up and they were accused of militarizing the South China Sea, which they were doing. But understand the context was the American pivot to Asia. It was greater U.S. Philippine military cooperation, all designed aimed at China. China's response was fine. China will increase its military presence near the Philippines to counter the growing American military presence. And one way they did that to undermine the pivot was to build up those islands with a military presence. During the same time, the Philippine fishing industry basically lost their fishing activities in much of the disputed waters, causing considerable hardship to the Philippine fishing economy. The Chinese also carried out extensive economic coercion and economic sanctions. So we recall that during the Arroyo government, trade boomed, soft loans boomed, just the opposite during the Aquino government. Tourism plummeted. The Chinese government actively warned the Chinese citizens to stay away from the Philippines, and that had a major effect so that charter tours, group tours, no longer went to the Philippines, causing an impact on the Philippine tourist economy. Philippine agriculture exports. Between 2014 and 2016, following the signing of the EDCA, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, and the filing by the Philippines at the Permanent Court of Arbitration and over the sovereignty dispute, banana exports to China declined by over 2/3. Between 2016, there was an over 40% reduction in overall food exports by the Philippines to China. Overall, Philippines exports declined by over 25% in the 2 years following the agreement. The Chinese direct foreign investment in the Philippines also declined. The decline began during the Scarborough Shoal incident, and between 2011 and 2015, there was a net reduction of Chinese investment in the Philippines. Not only was there no new investment, but overall Chinese investment actually declined during those years. So we have military harassment with the Navy. We have Coast Guard harassment, always creating the possibility of unintended conflict and hostility. We have harassment of the fishing industry, banana industry, food exports, and overall investment. China was punishing the Philippines. Now understand again, why were they punishing? It was not punishing the Philippines for their sovereignty policy. Punishing the Philippines for bringing the Americans into the region. And China was saying, you want to pay, we will make you pay a price, and you cannot count on the Americans to defend you. Look what they did at Scarborough Shoal. If you want to ease the tension, if you want to lower the likelihood of war, if you want to improve your economy, then you have to stop cooperating with the United States against China. Very clear, all their writings, this is not a sovereignty issue, this is not a nationalism, this is not even a Xi Jinping issue, although there's some elements there. This is a Chinese national interest to get the Americans off their coastal waters and thus resist Philippine cooperation with American containment in China. So the third part, the next stage of this event is the Duterte administration. And as you all know, Duterte was very different than the Aquino government. He said, look, China's a rising power, and America is a declining power. And first of all, he was right. But then second of all, he was quite blunt about that and the implications for Philippine national security. He says, why would I pick a fight with China? If I go to war, it's a matter of minutes, I will be pulverized. So he says he's going to move to the center of U.S. China relations and not take sides anymore. He says America is lost, China's on the upswing, we need to find a way to get along with China. And he said, I'm not picking a fight over the South China Sea and the territorial issues. Well, China says, you know, this is good. And now we begin to see China change its policy again, rewarding the Philippines for abandoning the Aquino government's policy on U.S.-China relations. All of a sudden, banana sales took off between China and the Philippines. During the last 3 months of 2016, banana exports to the Philippines doubled over the previous year. From 2016 to 2017, overall Philippine exports increased by over 25%. This is the way China operates. This is not a market economy. This is a centralized economy. China sends out the signal, do not import bananas. People don't import bananas. You import bananas, people start to import bananas. Sanctions are easy to put in place and then take off in China. From 2016 to 2019, Philippine banana exports to China increased by nearly 300%. Total Philippine exports to China increased by over 40%. And over that same time, when Duterte was in Beijing, Xi Jinping promised him multiple investment opportunities and investment in the Philippines infrastructure. Now, Chinese observers were very clear. What had happened here? The rise of China had transformed East Asia. Every country in East Asia and now has to take into account the rise of China. Now, it's typical to look at Duterte as how should we say, an unusual Philippine leader with many domestic atrocities that we can all agree were beyond the pale. But in his China policy, it looked a little bit like Singapore, a little bit like Malaysia, a little bit like Indonesia. And so what Duterte did is he brought Philippine foreign policy into line with the rest of Southeast Asia. Aquino was the outlier. Not Arroyo, not Duterte. Because the entire region is accommodating the rise of China. Li Hsien-loong in the Philippines, in Singapore, said we must bring China into this order. Malaysia has a territorial dispute with China. They filed, I think, 140 protests against China. Never made one public. Never allowed the territorial dispute to get in the way, and welcomed Chinese investment, which poured into the Philippines. I cannot begin to explain why Arroyo did why Aquino did what he did on foreign policy with China. Chinese believe it was because of corruption. He needed the support of the military. He needed the support of domestic industries, trying to protect them from China. I don't know. But we should not see Duterte as irrational when it came to China policy, but closer into the line what the other countries were doing in the region. Now, we have a new government in power in the Philippines. And my great concern is that we're moving toward a new era. As a second round of China's wedge strategies, of Chinese coercion against the Philippines. So how do I read Marcos and what he's doing? He has said that he will not make an issue out of the territorial dispute. Well, I'm not going to make China happy. But if he thinks he understands China, and that was the experience of the Aquino administration, he's wrong. The issue was not the territorial dispute. The issue was Philippine-U.S. relations. And so he's been improving relations with China quite considerably, which we'll come back to. But equally important, one of his first foreign visits by Marcos was to Beijing, where he had a summit with Xi Jinping. Now, presidents in other countries are all alike. You don't welcome another leader to your country, give him a royal banquet, an official welcome, unless you're confident that you have good relations. And Marcos sent signals that he was going to follow the policy of the Duterte administration. He said that throughout his campaign, and the first month of his administration, he said the same thing. So he goes off to Beijing, gets a royal welcome, and Xi Jinping promises him all kinds of aid, rewarding him for continuing the policy of the Duterte administration and, if you will, echoing the policy of the Arroyo government. But then Marcos goes back to Manila and begins to establish very strong military cooperation with the United States. Now, China has made very clear the issue is not the sovereignty dispute. Again, we had a wait-and-see period. But in the last months, there have been numerous Chinese signals to the Philippines. We do not want to see joint naval exercises between the United States and the Philippines in disputed waters. We do not want to see an increased military presence in the United States in the Philippines. We do not want to see growing U.S. naval presence and presence at Philippine bases near disputed waters. And Marcos has basically ignored this. He has reached agreement for American military presence at four new locations, two of which face Taiwan. One of these is right in the area where China and the Philippines have a dispute over territorial waters. The military exercises this year between China and the Philippines are the largest ever. Between the United States and the Philippines, the largest ever. And Marcos has made very clear that he's not going to allow China to stop him from cooperating with the United States. I would expect China to react rather strongly. I would think the first casualty for the Chinese, for the Philippines, is going to be fishing by Philippine fishermen in disputed waters. You will begin to see the Chinese Coast Guard harassing Philippine fishermen, and you'll see swarms of Chinese fishing boats, unarmed, but swarming around traditional Philippine fishing areas. That will make the Philippine fishermen so concerned and apprehensive that they will no longer fish in traditional Philippine fishing grounds. That will be very costly. Over time, I think you'll see banana exports dry, you'll see overall exports dry, and you'll see investment decline again. That will be the economic punishment, if you will, kind of economic coercion of the Philippines to try and drive that wedge between China and the Philippines, between the United States and the Philippines. Will China do another Scarborough Shoal? Well, the Chinese have been quite effective at this. They don't start things. So as I said, I think Scarborough Shoal was an opportunity for the Chinese insofar as the Philippines tried to detain Chinese fishermen using a military boat, creating the pretext for China to resist. It did the same thing with the Vietnamese later on. They did the same thing with Korea later on. If something were to happen in the South China Sea to give China a pretext, I imagine China could become quite coercive once again, threatening the Philippines with potential for unintended incidents, with that potential escalation to hostilities. And once again, I do not think the United States is going to want to get into a conflict with the Chinese over an incident with the Philippines. Once again, the Philippines are an outlier. Just yesterday, the day before, Lee Hsien-loong said upgraded relations with China. Malaysia said they're prepared to negotiate bilaterally with China over the territorial dispute. The Vietnamese are cooperating with China. The only two countries in all of East Asia, well, the only two, except for Japan, we have South Korea and the Philippines are improving cooperation with the United States. One can see South Korea being very careful. One can see the Philippines jumping at the opportunity. The U.S. is putting pressure on those two countries. South Korea is quite cautious. The Philippines is quite happy to jump into the American camp. China is not driven by a sovereignty dispute. It's not driven by the demand that Philippines recognize Chinese sovereignty. There's no energy here to speak of. Reed Bank has nominal amount, and they have no military significance. So let's ask why the Philippines is doing this. Why is the Philippines challenging China over territorial disputes? And why is the Philippines challenging China by cooperating with the United States when there is no military threat from China to the Philippines that anyone can see? China has no interest in occupying Philippine territory, no military threat to the Philippine Islands, but rather has been prepared to expand economic aid. So there is a strong drive in the Philippines that Philippines must defend its sovereignty. So I guess the bottom line here, to some extent, is that there's an emotional attachment to sovereignty, or a naturalist attachment to sovereignty has its costs. And the costs are food exports to China, the risk of military hostilities, loss of fishing grounds. In the context in which the United States continues to decline in South China Sea and China continues to rise. As a realist, I don't see the upside for the Philippines. I don't see the cost-benefit analysis working out. On the contrary, I see the cost-benefit working out for the Chinese. Every country in the region is watching this. No one is supporting the Philippines. They all see, if you will, Chinese patience as the Philippines ramps up cooperation with the United States against China. So that the Philippines is isolated within ASEAN, with little prospect for significant American support, should things get worse, and a major price to the Philippine economy. For the Chinese, one has to say they were very successful in driving a wedge between China and the United States and the Philippines during the Duterte administration. And then they are going to be rather embittered that the Marcos administration is moving in the wrong direction. In the United States and elsewhere, every country in the world, there is a tendency to see the problem in a bilateral relationship that's coming from the other side. So in the United States, we'll say, well, wolf diplomacy is China, it's just coming out of China. Or China's Taiwan policy is coming out of China. That is almost never the case in international relations. It's a political relationship where there's an action-reaction, national interest, competition. And the problem in China-Philippine relations is not China, it's not the Philippines. It's that there's a major conflict of interest going on that each side wants to change the policy of the other. And thus far, one must say that the Chinese are winning. They have determined to drive the United States, determined to weaken the American presence in the Philippines, but the United States can no longer use bases in the Philippines to challenge Chinese security. The Philippines is likely to pay a price for that, which from my perspective is unnecessary, given that the benefits could be rather great. And James, I'll leave it there.
Great. Thank you very much, Rob. A lot of really tricky issues to discuss here. So maybe I'll begin. I'll just once again mention to all those in the audience to please use the Q&A function for any questions that you might have. You can just enter those in at any time. One of the questions that had come in, you basically already addressed, which was the U.S. pivot and closer U.S. Philippine alliances and what the reaction might be. So I think we can go ahead and move to a different question. But so the one thing I wanted to raise was really related to your sort of analysis of the region and how sort of the way that you presented Philippines as kind of an outlier in relationship to Singapore, Malaysia, and then you mentioned other ASEAN countries. So the one place where at least I've noticed perhaps something that may go counter to that, perhaps, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is the case of Bangladesh, for example. So we have Bangladesh, right, who has been the one place. I mean, the Bangladesh strikingly has this rather successful economy that's growing, but it also is the one place that really pushed back against Chinese money, particularly BRI kind of money that they classified as use caution, this is a debt trap, blah blah blah, and then they also turned away this Russian ship that was going to be delivering nuclear material for power plant and as well. So it seems that I wonder then if you think there is perhaps other indications that other countries may begin to push back a little bit against China for various reasons, economic perhaps, but also geopolitical. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, because it strikes me as a very complicated situation. So
the focus I have is on East Asia.
Right.
And South Asia is just totally different. And in many ways, India has almost total hegemony in South Asia. It dominates Bangladesh, it dominates Sikkim, it dominates Bhutan, it dominates Nepal, so on and so forth. The only one left is Pakistan, and that's why China gave Pakistan nuclear technology so that it could survive the Indian pressure. So I don't see the rise of China over Bangladesh as a compelling process requiring Bangladesh conciliation of Chinese interests. When Nepal tried to move a little closer to China, India shut off Nepal's access to Indian territory for exports. That hurt, right? So that the Indian leverage over its immediate neighbors is just very strong. Now, that's a different question as to declining Chinese assistance, which I'm not aware of. After all, the Chinese give money around the world, right? Africa, Latin America, everywhere. Why anyone would want to decline Chinese aid, I don't know. You want a bridge, you don't go to America, you go to China. You want a railway, you don't go to America, you go to China. You want a seaport, you don't go to America, you go to China. If you want infrastructure, you go to China. Now, I'm not sure where Bangladesh fits into this, but China has been more than willing to expand its foreign aid programs to countries that have no strategic interest for them whatsoever. Think, Latin America, where the U.S. has hegemony, or think Africa, right? So I can't explain why the reluctance to accept Chinese economic assistance. One can only imagine that perhaps the Indians were leaning on it. That would be the only explanation I would have. The issue of debt diplomacy is a controversial one for a number of reasons. One, the Chinese Belt and Road and their Export-Import Bank and so on and so forth have probably over 1,000 projects around the world. We have one case, Sri Lanka, of a debt trap. Hardly what you might say would be a threat of China using aid to create debt traps. But then second, American scholars who have gone into Sri Lanka to look at the documents, 10,000 pages of documents, says it doesn't exist. There's nothing in the aid in the construction for the port that said if you fail to pay the loans, we get the port. It's just not there. It's just not. The term debt trap came from an Indian columnist. Not surprised. Got picked up by a New York Times columnist and now went viral. But it's just not there. But I don't really. I can't speak to Bangladesh's policy toward Chinese aid. I just don't know.
Okay. Yeah. So what about, I mean, looking in the other direction, then more into the more proximate to the Philippines as well, is you mentioned, I mean, we're all aware now of these, the U.S. Increased presence then at military bases in the Philippines, and these seems to be developing rather rapidly. And then you mentioned just very briefly a kind of the interesting note that some of these are facing towards Taiwan. And so how, I mean, in your mind, you're also a very close watcher of developments in Taiwan. How much is that factoring into this kind of posturing and positioning that's going on between Philippines, U.S., Philippines, China, and how do you understand what's happening there?
So I have to begin by saying that my perspective is a perspective one doesn't often hear.
Okay.
And I say that in part because I find the conventional wisdom on China-U.S. China relations reflects how we've been educated by the White House. Now, if the White House says to us, my economic policies will reduce inflation, no one believes them. You reach your own conclusions. When the White House says China's planning to invade Taiwan, we all believe them. Well, if they're not telling us the truth on their economic policy, why do we believe them on their China policy? So it's incumbent upon all of us to step back and use our own analytical capabilities based upon our own understanding, rather than allow governments to shape policy perspectives. So on Taiwan, the first point is that there is no threat of Taiwan invasion. The United States has made very clear that China does not have the ability to invade. What we have seen, they haven't had the ability to invade ever since 1940, ever. Well, we have said that Xi Jinping has ordered his military to have the ability to invade in 2027. Well, there are two problems there. Maybe they will have it, maybe they'll succeed, maybe they won't. And two, if they do have it, doesn't mean they plan to invade. Second, those bases that face Taiwan, and this is the other problem for the Philippines. If there is a war over Taiwan, the United States wants to use those bases will be destroyed overnight by Chinese missiles. They will not last a day. And so, to put it bluntly, those missiles are not very helpful to the United States. I'm sorry, those bases are not helpful to the United States. They're not going to be effective. So why are we doing this? Well, that's a very good question. We're doing this because we want to put as much pressure on China anywhere we can to try and restrain the rise of China. And we're trying to maintain American access to our security partners in the region by reassuring them of American intent to remain an Asian power to resist the rise of China. The bases are not going to help us fight China because Guam is going to be out of action. I'll give you an example. Subic and Clark are going to be gone. So as a warfighting capability, they're just not there. And should we dare to try and use them? Well, the Philippines will become a target of Chinese missiles. So the Taiwan issue, we changed our Taiwan policy in 2018 under Donald Trump. There was no greater threat to Taiwan at the time. There still is no greater threat to Taiwan. Why? Because we began to see the rise of China. It made us nervous. So we reached out to the Philippines with Obama and the pivot because China made us nervous. Biden, I will give him credit, has signaled the region that he is far tougher on China and willing to risk conflict with China, far more so than either Obama or Trump. That gives Marcos some confidence that the Chinese will not give him too hard a time. That's not too far off, because the Chinese are going to be more cautious, because the Americans have succeeded in painting China as an aggressive, belligerent country and hurting China's behavior of cooperation around the world. The last thing China needs is to be seen as beating up on the Philippines, and that'll kill it in Europe, it'll kill it in Korea, everywhere else. So he's taking advantage of that environment, with the Biden administration showing greater resolve. But there's a lot China can do with before eliciting hostilities. Kill the fishing industry, kill the banana industry, kill the tourist industry. And if the opportunity poses itself, you create an environment which there is a risk of escalation just by something going wrong, not by Chinese activities. And that's what they did to the Philippines at Scarborough Shoal. They did to Vietnam in 2014. So what happens if the ship sinks? Uh-oh, now we're in trouble.
Yeah. Just like we saw, I can't remember what year that was, right? When you had the accident of the that happened, and all of a sudden things get ramped up, just by
Which accident with whom?
Between U.S. and China, right? That was it.
We had the EP3 go down.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Things happen. Uh-oh. Well,
Yeah.
what happens if in leaving Scarborough Shoal they sink a Chinese Coast Guard ship?
Yeah.
You really want to sink a Chinese Coast Guard ship? That so maybe we don't want to start that process and see what happens. Yeah.
So sticking with this general sort of line of questioning, and then I'll come back to a different one. But this one was from one of our audience asking about saying how they would imagine that the PRC is thrilled that the USMC is relocating from Okinawa to Guam. Do you expect this might encourage the PRC to continue or increase militarization of ECS, I guess East China Sea, or maybe?
So I guess two or three things. Yeah, we're beefing up the presence in Guam, but we shouldn't think it's reducing the presence in Okinawa, Japan. The United States is increasing its marine presence on the Ryukyu Islands between Japan and Taiwan. And you ask, why are we doing that? Because the only way for the Chinese Navy to get from the East China Sea to the Pacific Ocean is to go through those islands. So we're going to be there waiting for them to try. I'm afraid, sorry to be a realist and talk about war, but that's what we're doing. We're building up the marine presence on the Ryukyu Islands in order to prevent the Chinese from being able to sail into the Western Pacific. What we're doing on Guam with the Marines is creating a presence for the Marines to move to any island, a large basing presence that gives the ability to jump around the region, such as the islands, the Ryukyus, in order to interdict Chinese naval activities trying to reach the Western Pacific. What drives American policy today, and I suggested before, that the Chinese are succeeding in the South China Sea. The reverse to that is the Americans have decided that they cannot rely on any country in the South China Sea for defense cooperation during a war. Because China can destroy the bases, and no country in that part of the world wants to get involved in the war. So what are we doing? We're retreating to the Western Pacific and the Indian Ocean. Micronesia, Papua New Guinea, Guam, Wake, Tinian. This is what we're doing. So that's where Guam fits in for the Marines.
Yeah. Before getting to the next question, another question sort of popped up in my own mind just about the overall kind of U.S. Changes in their own policies, where we came out of a Trump era that had more or less withdrawn from Southeast Asia and engagement with South ASEAN countries. And then you have Biden going off to the ASEAN meeting in was that November, late November, and then on to Bali for the G20 as well. So what is your perspective then on these new signs of U.S. engagement then in Southeast Asia? Is this, and then you had actually, come to think of it, you also had Kamala Harris then that went off to the Philippines as well, right? Off to one of the islands on the west side of the Philippines. Is this signaling some other type, in addition to the presence on the military bases, is this part of a larger strategy that you can see beginning to be formulated by the U.S. government, and how might that be received in Southeast Asia itself? I know I was in Jakarta in December, and there was a lot of discussion about Pelosi's trip to Taiwan and how, they thought this was, really not a good thing. And so there was a very interesting conversation going on just about what the U.S. is doing. So any thoughts that you have on that, just in terms of this larger argument?
This is, if you will, might call an all-of-government approach to reinforcing American strategic partnerships in East Asia. So Marcos will soon visit the White House.
Right.
And as you said, Harris went to the Philippines. And so we're doing everything we can to strengthen the American political, military, economic presence in the region. So as to tell the region, we are here, you can count on us. Now, there are two problems with that. The region can see the change in the military balance very easily. And words end up being what a realist would call cheap talk.
Mm-hmm.
So over the longer term, it's just not clear how effective this is going to be, particularly if China feels it needs to prove something. But second, the United States cannot compete with China in terms of economic cooperation. Every economic initiative we have is absent any discussion of market access for the other side. We do not give market access. So we say we can have an agreement on child labor laws. Thanks very much. We can have an agreement on better standards for the environment. Thanks very much. We can have, that's not what these countries want. They want access for their goods. And China is more than willing to do that with a market of 1.4 billion people. We'll buy anything you want. Tell us what you want. So we can't compete economically. The trend is not good militarily. So this is what, when you look at what the Philippines is doing and Marcos is doing, there's an element there that says, I am not Duterte. I'm not a lunatic. I'm not a human rights disaster. I am thoughtful, I am calibrated, and I am going to have a foreign policy that reflects Philippine security interests and defend our security, cooperate with the United States. If Duterte was so far too close to China, we've done some whiplash going too far the other way. Now, in the case of South Korea, every time there's a leadership change, it goes back one way or the other. But every time you have a leadership change that moves back to the United States, they're not as close to the United States as they were the time before. So it's not a straight line because of the back and forth, but if you draw a line between those shifts, cooperation in the United States has been declining over time, and with China increasing. What makes Marcos an exception is he's gone right back, full speed ahead, to where Aquino was, if not more so. Which makes it, again, an outlier. It's hard to explain. No one anywhere thinks the Chinese are prepared to go to war against the Philippines. It's just not there. So one is reduced to explaining this by an appeal to nationalism. And that always gets realists worried. It just does.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting when you think back to the election, right? That if I recall correctly, I mean, one of the policy distinctions that was drawn was that that Marcos Jr. was going to keep that sort of perspective of, allowing the Chinese fishing in you call it South China Sea or the West Philippine Sea. And which struck me as carrying on Duterte's position, but also very strange in a way domestically in the Philippines, because then how do you garner the support of the large fishing industry that needs access to that region and everything too? Mm-hmm. So I wonder, what was it that caused him to have this sort of unless I'm mistaken, I mean, I thought that was part of the policy, and so what caused his sort of turnabout here during this period right after the election?
So after the election, he said, "We'll be friend to all and enemy to none."
Yeah.
He said Marcos's security advisor said that Duterte's policy on the islands was the height of pragmatism. Right? And of course, we will follow that. When Marcos met Xi Jinping, he said, "We won't choose sides in the United States and China."
Mm-hmm.
What happened?
Yeah.
I think he just felt he could fool China into believing that he would be cooperative while at the same time move close to the United States. If I were Xi Jinping, I'd be really angry.
Yeah.
Okay. I welcomed you. I gave you a banquet. I hosted you to a fine Chinese banquet. And then you embarrassed me, right? Now, the United States is leaning on every country in the world, twisting every arm. South Korea, Japan, the Dutch over semiconductors. We're leaning on the French big time. So we are leaning on every country in the world to align with us against China. And I know we lean on the Philippines, and we lean on South Korea, and we're leaning on Japan. But that's not enough to explain what's going on. Because you could have given the United States a little bit while not going as far as we've gone, which is what South Korea is trying. Australia is going the other direction, trying to restore trade with China. I don't know if I were to guess with no knowledge whatsoever, the Philippine economy is in terrible shape coming out of COVID. So maybe he needs nationalism for legitimacy. I don't know. Mm-hmm. But you're not going to come out of COVID with greater economic growth if you can't sell bananas to China. This is the time where China has greater leverage than ever over Philippine economic trajectory, because they need that market. Mm-hmm. And I just think the Chinese are going to twist that market very strongly.
And just let it get exacerbated.
Let it die. Yeah.
Okay. So you have a question from a colleague, I guess, at your places that you associate with the Norwegian Defense University College and also the MIT Security Studies Program, a visiting Fulbright scholar. And I'll just read it. It's a little bit of a longer one. So the question is that they're not clear whether the U.S. military presence in the Philippines has been weakened, and if not, has China's wedge strategy worked? Is U.S. military cooperation with its allies, South Korea, Japan, Australia, in the region weakened over the last decade? If not, has the China wedge strategy worked? If U.S. has increased its military cooperation with its regional allies, does security trump China's economic coercion? So there's no accounting for personality.
Right. And, Donald Trump did not act in the American interest. And I would argue that Aquino did not work in the Philippine interest, because there was no upside and downside for the economy. It hurt the economy and risked war. Put it differently, there's no free lunch in international relations. You pay a price for things, right? So in the Philippines, domestic politics somehow or another seems to be dominating. When it's dominating and nationalism is strong, it is not possible to use any instrument of policy to try and achieve your objective, because the government that you're targeting is developing policy on following its domestic interests, not the international interest. So the objective of the other country must be to make the leader pay a sufficiently high price for appealing to domestic interests so as to compel that leader to begin to focus on international interests. Right? That's what coercion's for in this context, right? So yes, China has not been successful insofar as there is a resurgence of American military presence in the Philippines. But I'm not sure China could have done anything about that. A soft line would not have been helpful. China could not go to the Philippines and say, we don't like your cooperation with the United States. Would you please stop it? And we'll be nice to you. That just wouldn't work. And a hard line is not working either in the short term. If China continues to rise, it will work. There are short-term blips. The South Koreans have refused to deploy so far more missile defense in their country, acknowledging China's interests. And the South Koreans have also so far have not supported American policy on Taiwan and not have supported American policy on the Quad in East Asia or Asia. They've been a little forward leaning on collaborating with American military presence in Asia, but that one bears watching. Don't know where it's going. China's remained successful with the Philippines, with Malaysia, with Indonesia that's opposed the AUKUS agreement with Australia. Vietnam has worked just fine. So the two countries in the region that are the most difficult to deal with, if I can say country, two places, Taiwan and the Philippines. And they're both really nationalistic anti-China right now. That's the common denominator. And there's nothing China can do to change Taiwan's policy. They're never winning the hearts and minds in Taiwan because there's nothing the Chinese can do to make the people in Taiwan like the Chinese Communist Party, right? Hearts and minds are relevant. And the same thing in the Philippines. As long as there's a sovereignty dispute, the Philippines are going to defend the sovereignty dispute, their sovereignty, and rely on the Americans are going to do it, as long as there's nationalism in command. Japan is the one exception that is cooperating more with the United States and makes sense. It's a very powerful country in its own right. It's the most important American ally in the world. It has confidence that America will defend it. You know, that makes sense. If I were the Philippines, I wouldn't depend on the United States. If I'm South Korea, I don't depend on the United States. Japan, I depend on the United States. You have two more questions?
Well, yeah. Actually, one I wanted to ask you just about again, I'm intrigued by your comments about how the Philippines is kind of an outlier in the equation here with other ASEAN countries. So you've got ASEAN and also this RCEP group, basically one of the largest trading blocks now in the world, so. To your knowledge, are there discussions among ASEAN countries themselves to sort of fall into alignment in a position as kind of again, I think my understanding is that all of them would sort of like to have not be pushed into a position of having to choose between the U.S. or China and to serve as a kind of a buffer, if you will, between the U.S. and China. So that raises the question then about the Philippines' position and its membership or its role within ASEAN to me. So are there, how united and lockstep are ASEAN countries in dealing with this kind of positioning between the two?
In 2012, over Scarborough Shoal, there was a deathly silence.
Yeah.
And I think this is happening again. They're not going to criticize, but they're not going to support. Basically, you're on your own. But I think you're right in that ASEAN would like the Americans to remain engaged. They don't want it to become a Chinese lake. They don't want to have Chinese hegemony in Southeast Asia. But they don't want the Americans starting a war in Southeast Asia that they get caught up in. They want the Americans to peacefully accommodate the rise of China so they can both compete together inside Southeast Asia. The Philippines is, from the perspective of many, including Malaysia and Indonesia and Singapore, making this more difficult. I don't think any of them are going to lean on the Philippines as a united front, but they're going to allow, and they're not going to criticize China if something happens if Philippines finds their fishing industries drying up and their exports drying up. They will say nothing because they have made very clear, Lee Hsien-loong has made very clear. If you're losing access to the Chinese market, this is your fault. Get your policy together. And I think that's where they all are. You have another question up there I'd be happy to respond to.
Okay, I'll let you take that one if you've read it.
Yeah, so am I a patriot? Am I a globalist? I'm a patriot. But the problem is that we've defined patriotism in America as only something that reflects support for American foreign policy and American interests in the world. And I believe there's no such thing as the national interest. America has many national interests. We have a national interest in universal health care. We have a national interest in balancing, in reducing the federal deficit. We have a national interest in improving our infrastructure at home. We have a national interest in protecting American security in the world, which means that we have to weigh these competing interests in such a way as to maximize the value to America from all these interests without sacrificing any of them. And if you want to compete and so American policy today is to compete with China to maintain America's #1 status in the world. That's going to be very, very expensive. How do you maintain a healthy economy and keep the deficit under control, have enough money for healthcare, infrastructure, keep Social Security solvent, and so on and so forth? I don't think you can do it. And then second, why do you have to be #1 in the world? America doesn't worry about being attacked. We have hegemony in the Western Hemisphere. Why is it necessary that we try and resist China in East Asia and be #1 in the South China Sea, which is what the Biden administration wants, at the cost of universal health care, Medicaid, Social Security, education, infrastructure? And second, diplomacy has become a 4-letter word in the United States. It was Prime Minister Rabin of Israel who advocated negotiations with the Palestinians by saying, if you want peace, well, then you negotiate with the enemy. Who else do you negotiate with? Negotiation, diplomacy has become a 4-letter word in the United States. If you want to avoid war, well, you may look for a way to hold negotiations, to make compromises where you can, to resist where you can, but compromise where you can. And so when I look at the rise of China in East Asia, I think, well, East Asia is moving from a U.S. hegemonic environment in maritime East Asia to one of bipolarity. What's wrong with that? The entire Cold War in Europe was bipolar, and that kept us secure and peaceful. Why do we need hegemony at the cost of Medicare, Social Security, infrastructure, education, and reduced deficit? We've lost sight of the costs of international relations in the pursuit of #1, and we've lost sight of the sources of the U.S. China conflict, where, I understand that in East Asia, the Chinese are, in particular in the Philippines, are seen as a problem. But as I said earlier, I don't see Chinese behavior and their wedge strategies and their interest in reducing American presence in Chinese borders as belligerent or aggressive. I see as predictable and expected. And the Chinese have benefited immensely from a cooperative relationship with the world beginning in Deng Xiaoping, and through first the China-ASEAN Free Trade Agreement, then the more recent trade agreements with ASEAN, with Korea and other countries. And so they have a major initiative, or a peace offensive, if you will, to expand their presence. the United States has been the one who has been pushing back because we don't like what peace and stability has done to the decline of American power relative to China and the decline of America as no longer number one. And so that's been costly. Well, Taiwan's part of that. The trade war is part of that. The tech war is part of that. The ideological war is part of that. Our Philippine policy is part of that. And so the larger question is, what are we risking? How much it costs? And is it worth it? And my own perspective is that it's very costly and it's not required for American security. And we can do better in allocating our resources to our domestic problems, which are severe. I'd only add to that also that when I look at the United States and our policy in Asia and our foreign policy making process, we've lost sight of, well, put it this way. The American Navy basically agrees with me. The American Navy looks at the trend in U.S. China competition and says the United States is losing badly. And we're losing badly because we don't have enough money, our ships are old, and the Chinese have lots of money and their ships are new, and they're building more ships than we are. The American Navy policy is, let's stop spending all this money on a Navy that's old and on ships that are no longer relevant, and reduce the size of the American Navy and take the money you saved and rebuild America's shipbuilding industry and naval infrastructure so that we can build a better Navy. I think that makes perfect sense. I think the Navy is being quite sensible here. But what are the implications? The implication of that is a voluntary diminished presence of the Americans in the South China Sea. The American Navy will necessarily get smaller if you're going to stop using and decommission older ships and useless ships. And with a smaller Navy, you're going to have less time at sea, and you're going to basically saying in the short term, next 15, 20 years, we're going to spend less time in the South China Sea. I think that's good for two reasons. One, it helps us build a good Navy in the future, and two, it reduces the risk of war with China in what is becoming increasingly crowded South China Sea. To me, that's patriotic. Of supporting American domestic institutions and then the American agenda for reducing poverty and maintaining benefits for our senior citizens and building infrastructure and education, maintaining a bipolar East Asia, and rebuilding the American Navy. I can't think of anything more patriotic than that.
What would your perspective be though on, again, just sort of, even if say your predictions or thinking about the U.S. presence in the region versus when one looks to Southeast Asia and the ASEAN group of 10 countries united there under that agreement, these are places where at least from what I understand and have seen in some places, you have rapidly developing economies that are doing quite well. And would there be, if there were pushback, say by ASEAN countries as a united bloc or to something, a policy of China, would that have an impact? Or would it be taken seriously? Would it be something that would be effective?
So it's almost axiomatic in international relations that small countries don't unite against big countries. It's just too dangerous, right? I mean, you just never see it, right?
Even as a bloc.
As a bloc, because you can put a lot of countries together to deal with a great power. What you have is a lot of little countries. And so none of them are going to feel comfortable in that environment. And no one trusts anyone else, so they're afraid of being sold out. And so, you end up with divide and rule and everything else. It just doesn't work. They're very prosperous countries. Certainly, they're doing quite well. Many are benefiting in the region from American policy of trying to distribute our supply chains and our investments. So that would be Vietnam in particular. but Malaysia is doing well. Indonesia has been doing well. Singapore. Another thing to remember when you think about the South China Sea as an economic region, this includes the Philippines. As an economic region, its importance to the United States is close to zero. I shouldn't say, I take that back. Yeah, oh no. The South China Sea as a strategic waterway for trade for the United States is close to zero. This is two reasons. When the United States trades with Asia, it goes across the Western Pacific. It goes right into the Philippines, never goes to the South China Sea. It goes right to Japan, never goes to the South China Sea, right to Taiwan, right to South Korea, never goes into the South China Sea. So that the region itself, the South China Sea, as a waterway for U.S. trade with the region is very small in importance. But second, and you'll see, you hear all kinds of false statistics out there. False. The Malaccan Strait and the South China Sea is the most important waterway in the world for international trade. That's true. But where's the trade going? All going to China. So the United States is in the South China Sea for trade that's going to China. We're going to use our Navy to defend Chinese trade in the South China Sea. Hey, that's not what we do. No. Right? So the shipping in the South China Sea goes from Singapore to China. Singapore doesn't trade with Thailand. Philippines doesn't trade with Thailand. It's all going into the Chinese hub, and it goes from Europe through the Malaccan Strait to China, most of it. So that we need to rethink how important those sea lanes are to American security, because they're more important to China than they are to anyone else, and certainly not the United States. So the countries have all kinds of explanations to why they do things. Same way the Biden administration may have an explanation why they have a particular economic plan. There will be, we need to lower inflation. No, the real reason is they are good American liberals. They want to increase spending to help deal with inequality in America. But you're going to cloak it as an anti-inflation policy. All right, that's good. That's good. But the same thing, why are we in the South China Sea? It's the most important waterway in the world. That's not why we're in the South China Sea. It's the most important waterway in the world to China. That's not why we're in. So for the Philippines, so we have to think of China for East Asia the way you think of the United States for NAFTA, or you think of Germany for the EU. Those are the hubs for a regional trade bloc. And China is the hub of the regional trade bloc in a hub and spoke kind of thing, where the trade routes are going in and out of China between individual countries in the region. And that's and China, of course, is growing twice as fast as the United States, with the market 4 times the size of the U.S. market. That's a very strong pull for trade. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks very much. And we're right at the time right now. I think, watching this over the next, in the foreseeable future here, to watch all of these developments take place and just see what the Philippines ultimately ends up doing, or if this kind of pattern that you've been identifying here in terms of we're sort of looking at things repeating themselves in a sense too, or you've set it up in these kind of two camps in a way of what the options are. Well, it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. So
I'm very nervous for the Philippines going forward.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, we'll keep an eye on that. But thanks very much for just sharing all of your perspective on this, and we'll see how it all plays out in the coming months and year. Before signing off, I would like to just put in a plug for the very last talk of this series as well before we thank you. And that is the final talk will happen on April 26th at 7 p.m. Also on the same format. This talk will be a little bit different in that we'll shift from some of our recent talks on that have been looking at politics and things like that in the Philippines. And this will be by Felipe Pereda, Professor Felipe Pereda, who's the Ferdinand Zobel de Ayala Professor of Spanish Art and the History of Art and Architecture program here at Harvard. And the talk will be Fernando Zobel, Painting Across 3 Continents. And this is based on an exhibition that's been up at the Prado Museum in Spain by the artist Fernando Zobel. So please join us then if you can make it. And then we'll say one more final thank you to Professor Ross. Thanks for your talk tonight, and thank you all for signing on this evening.
Thank you, James.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Good night.